My mom got sick and she started to display the earliest symptoms of Lewy body dementia, which is akin to having both Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease at the same time.
So this really honed your interest.
The most important person in my life, I was seeing cognitively decay right before my very eyes. And that was the call for me to learn everything that I possibly could about these conditions so that I could help her. My mom, in many ways, was victimized by a lot of the misinformation that continues to be perpetuated.
One of the comments that I've heard you say is that 99.6% of the Alzheimer's research was actually fraudulent.
A paper was published in 2006. Thousands of papers have referenced this one 2006 paper. 16 years worth of research was built on this fraudulent paper. They failed because Alzheimer's disease research looking in the wrong place.
You're into the brain boosting foods. What is an Alzheimer's preventative diet?
I like to focus on what I call the genius foods. These are foods that provide the brain the nutrients that we know help the brain not just survive, but thrive.
Were there any takeaways for you from the documentary that you did that we didn't cover?
One thing that really shocked me was the risk that
Hey guys, welcome back to the Ultimate Human Podcast. I'm your host, human biologist Gary Brecka, where we go down the road of everything anti-aging, biohacking, longevity, and everything in between. And today's guest, I'm a huge fan of today's guest, Max Lugavere. I've been on Max's podcast, so it's high time that he came and was on my podcast. We see eye to eye on so many things. We were actually talking about the corruption in our food supply right before we started filming this podcast. So I can't wait to just get into this and let it roll. Max, welcome to the podcast, brother.
Thanks so much, Gary, for having me. It's an honor.
It's good to see you again.
Same.
I actually got 3 boxes of really good, healthy cereal out of the last podcast. Yeah. His house is like my house. When I walked in, it was just like stacks of all these sponsors. He's like, "You want some protein powder? You want an electrolyte? You want?"
Dude, I love it. I mean, you could pretty much build CBUM from the ground up. From the amount of protein that's in my house. It's amazing.
No, that is so true. But we had a great podcast, and I love the journey that you've been on because your background's in journalism.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you didn't really have a health and wellness, formal training background, but really, I've had so many influential, impactful guests on my podcast. And I find there's like a common theme to all of them. And I think it's common to you too, germane to you too, and that's that at some point in their life, they solved the problem or they were presented with a problem, and in solving it, this became a part of their purpose and passion. And for for you, I know it was your mom's journey with Alzheimer's. And I don't know that a lot of people know about that journey. So I'd love if you would share that and maybe even talk about how that led to your documentary, you actually using your journalism skills and self-funding and eventually crowdfunding and bringing documentary to light. I had the fortune of watching the July 8th podcast you did with Dr. Perlmutter. And man, it just really opened my eyes, to the paucity of understanding of the mental health crisis that we're in and how research maybe even has gone in the wrong direction.
Yeah, totally. Well, yeah. So I love to be hyper transparent about my background. I never want to misrepresent myself. I started my career as a generalist journalist. I got really lucky. I had a dream job out of college that I landed as a host, producer, and ultimately a journalist for a TV network in the United States called Current TV. So
is that in LA?
It was based in LA,
okay.
But it was a national TV network in 100 million homes. So from jump, like as soon as I graduated college, I rolled into this dream job on television where I got to talk about, really interesting stories that I thought were being under discussed in the culture at large. And it was a really amazing platform. And I got to work with actually some of the best journalists in the field, like in the field of journalism, which, has, I think today take on a bit of a different hue that career path, because mainstream media has become so polarized.
Right.
But back when I started, at a naive 22, 23 years old, it was an incredible job opportunity. And there I got to kind of feel out my passions and explore the topics that I thought were interesting and important, and communicate those topics to a massive audience. It was just an incredible gift. And I did that for 6 years. And prior to that, in college, I actually began college on a pre-med track. So I'd always been,
Oh, wow. Okay.
yeah,
I
I'd
didn't
always
know
been
that.
super passionate about health and nutrition and fitness, but it was a private passion. It was something that I was,
Mm.
growing up, I think I was, a lot of people will relate to it. I felt really kind of introverted and out of place and insecure as a high schooler. And I discovered bodybuilding and fitness, and I just became fascinated by that world and the science underpinning muscle hypertrophy and all that stuff.
Dude, I'm going to dig up some of your old bodybuilding videos and roll them over this.
Well, no, I was never a bodybuilder. Like, I don't think I ever had the genes for it. I was never an athlete, but I was just fascinated by the applied science of, you eat a certain way, you take a few potions, powders, supplements, whatever, and it manifests in terms of like a bigger, stronger, better body. And I just thought that was like the coolest thing ever. Particularly for somebody that was like kind of shy growing up,
Yeah.
But ultimately I realized that I was a storyteller and I had certain talents in that regard. And that led to me, becoming a journalist. And so I did that for 6 years, learning from the best of the best in the industry. And then in my late 20s, after that job had kind of run its course, my mom got sick and she started to display the earliest symptoms of what would ultimately be diagnosed as a rare form of dementia called Lewy body dementia, which is akin to having both Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease.
Right, but it's not either.
It's not either of those conditions, although it actually has more in common with Parkinson's disease than it does Alzheimer's disease. It's a condition that, unlike Alzheimer's disease, which is primarily a neurocognitive disorder, and Parkinson's disease, which is a movement disorder, somebody with Lewy body dementia typically presents with both movement symptoms and cognitive symptoms.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that's why they say it's like having Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease at the same time.
Yikes.
But from the pathophysiology of it is actually more similar to Parkinson's disease in that there's dysfunction in what's called the substantia nigra region of the brain, which is, becomes dysfunctional in Parkinson's disease. The dopamine producing neurons in that part of the brain start to die. And there's misfolding of a protein called alpha synuclein. And so unlike Alzheimer's disease, where, Alzheimer's disease it's a related condition, but it has more to do with amyloid beta and reduced glucose metabolism in the brain. And all of these conditions have
type 3 diabetes.
Yeah, type 3 diabetes. Exactly. So, but I didn't go to medical school and become a neurologist. Like I learned everything that I now know and have written books about and even academic literature about on the job, because the most important person in my life, I was seeing cognitively decay right before my very eyes.
Yeah. And I think sadly, a lot of times by the time the diagnosis is made, it's because of the expression of the disease. It's already really set in, it's hard to go back in time, maybe to slow or stop the progression, but very often, especially dopaminergic conditions, it's very hard to go backwards.
Yeah. I mean, these are essentially diseases of midlife with symptoms that appear in late life. But by the time you catch it, it's already a condition that's decades, set into motion by decades.
Right.
Similar to so many other conditions that are now saddling society, whether we're talking cardiovascular disease, cancer. For example, pancreatic cancer is a great analogy. Most of the time, the vast majority of the time pancreatic cancer is diagnosed, it's already too late because there are no routine screening processes for pancreatic cancer. So by the time it's caught, so to speak, and I can somewhat speak to this because my mom actually passed due to pancreatic cancer.
Wow.
By the time it's diagnosed, it's already, typically metastasized and, inoperable.
Right.
And similarly with Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, by the time you're diagnosed, this is a 30, 40-year disease process that you're now starting to see the symptoms.
I totally agree with you. And I mean, that's why the genesis of type 3 diabetes, insulin resistance in the brain, I believe blood sugar is the root of all evil. We have a pandemic of overeating and processed foods and high glycemic diets. And we are not genetically predisposed to consume those forms of calories and to filter out the cellular waste that comes and the metabolic insult that comes from having a diet rich in highly processed foods and very, very, very high glycemic profiles. I think one of the worst things that ever happened to the mental health crisis was the big war on fat. Right.
I think it's a big problem. Yeah, I think that was a massive public health mistake because, you demonize natural fat-containing foods like red meat, eggs, dairy fat. What do you replace those foods with on the plate? it just, all that did was serve to open the door for
red
all
dye
the,
number 40.
yeah, the proliferation of red dye number 40, proliferation of these ultra processed foods, which now dominate our diets. You know, depending on which demographic you look at, our diets are consumed by either 60% ultra processed foods or up to 80% or more, you know, depending on which age bracket you look at. And I think that is largely the result of the fact that we've demonized for so many years these otherwise perfectly healthful foods.
Right. You know, but going back to your mom's condition, she wasn't, you know, I think very often we think of Alzheimer's and dementia as diseases on the very elderly.
Yeah.
We think it's a condition that you catch later in life, you know, in your very advanced years. And much to your point, and I happen to very much agree with you, these are diseases of midlife that progress to later in life. So, so this really honed your interest in this condition.
Yeah. Well, I think most of it, as you so eloquently said, you know, most people's interaction with these conditions are through a grandparent. But my mom was young. My mom was in her mid 50s, and she still had all the pigment in her hair. And she was very much somebody who anybody would describe as being in the prime of her life. And so I couldn't write off what I was seeing to old age. I couldn't.
Right.
It was a massive tragedy in my family to watch the matriarch, you know, decline every day, get worse and worse and worse. And at a certain point, I decided that I had to accompany her to doctors' offices because, you know, when you have anybody who's ever suffered from a chronic condition knows that, you know, it's a scary and frustrating and confusing place to be. And so I started accompanying my mom to doctor's appointments, and I experienced in every situation, in every instance, what I've come to call diagnose and adios.
Yeah.
And that was the call for me to learn everything that I possibly could about these conditions. Not even to, I mean, not to write books or to do all the things that I now am, I think, known for. It was initially so that I could help her.
Right.
Of course. I mean, that was it. And over the course of that journey, I've learned all of these, like, I think, really important principles about how to protect our brains as we age.
Yeah. And one of those core principles, well, first of all, you know, one of the things that you highlighted, and I would encourage everybody to check out the documentary, Little Empty Boxes. You can just go to littleemptyboxes.com and actually see the documentary you put together. But I think, you know, your message, very similar to my message, is actually a message of hope. And by that, I mean that I think very often people think that disease and pathology is something that happens to us rather than something that happens within us. And we don't really think that there's much that we can do to prevent disease. You know, we're predisposed to the notion that disease is genetically inherited. And while I do believe that some diseases, you know, have a genetic predisposition, it's not your destiny. Your epigenetic factors make a huge difference in the progression of that disease. And listening to you talk about the journey that you went on with your mother was very inspiring to me. And I think it's inspiring to other people because you talk about the basics, you know, the absolute basics that people need to be doing, like whole food diets and avoiding processed foods. And you even highlight some of the corruption in our institutions of research that are funded by the companies that have outcomes, you know, the predetermined outcomes. And I'm very much on the same page with that too. I don't think that, you know, everybody in big pharma is out to kill us, but I do think that, you know, a lot of these corporations are out to make a profit. And the way that you make a profit is you script the narrative to lead you to your pharmaceutical, your synthetic, your chemical, or what have you, that you happen to have a patent on.
Yeah.
And one of the comments that I've heard you say is that 99.6% of the Alzheimer's research was actually fraudulent.
Well, the drugs, yeah,
or failures. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
There was a big research study that was fraught with fraud.
Well, yeah, 16 years worth of research was built on this fraudulent paper, but that is, yeah. So I mean, what you said is not inaccurate in the sense that it's par for it's part of the milieu that has led to this figure that 99.6% of Alzheimer's drug trials fail. They fail because we've been, particularly for the past 16 years of Alzheimer's disease research, looking in the wrong place.
One of my favorite biohacks outside of breath work by far is mineral salts, Baja Gold sea salt. It's got all of the trace minerals that the body needs. Most of us are not just protein deficient, meaning amino acid deficient, or fatty acid deficient. We are mineral deficient. So a quarter teaspoon of this in water first thing in the morning will make sure that you get all of the essential minerals that you need. It tastes amazing. In fact, I made a steak today. I actually made a grass-fed steak with grass-fed butter, and I put just mushrooms and a little bit of rosemary, and I sprinkled Baja Gold sea salt all over the top. Try it. It'll be your new favorite for cooking too. It's the cheapest and one of my favorite biohacks. I don't know, a $15 or $20 bag of this will probably last you 5 years. It's literally the world's best biohacking secret.
Now let's get back to the Ultimate Human podcast. And what do you attribute that to? If you go back to the paper for the people that are not familiar with that, go back to that paper and how did it come out that it was, I even took a deep dive and they found out that even some of the images were photoshopped. I mean, it was a pretty cognizant.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't like we just took the data and sort of omitted a few things so it leaned in this direction. But this was like a cognizant, attempt or success.
Yeah.
In covering up the truth. I mean,
in maligning the research. So basically the way that this all happened, and for anybody who's unfamiliar with the story, I mean, it's a fairly complicated story, but I'll try to do my best to synthesize it. So since Alzheimer's disease was first coined in 1906 by Austrian physician Alois Alzheimer, the guiding premise for what the pathophysiology of the disease is that it's a condition caused by an aggregation of certain proteins in the brain that misfold.
The neurofibrillary tangles, right?
Yes, those tau, this protein called tau, and the aggregation of another protein called amyloid beta into these plaques that accumulate in the extracellular space around neurons. And, you have to imagine that in 1906, our tools were fairly rudimentary in terms of medicine, imaging and things like that, right? So when somebody passed from Alzheimer's, back then, what they would do, and this makes intuitive sense, right? You would open up the brain of the cadaver that had passed from it to observe what's different. Well, in the brain of somebody who's passed from Alzheimer's disease, you see global shrinkage. So the brain neurons die at an accelerated pace. You see global, shrinkage in terms of the total brain volume, as well as, more intricate structures like the hippocampus. And then you see these plaques, these hallmark characteristics of the disease. And so essentially since then, the guiding sort of pharmaceutical approach is how, can we develop a drug that can essentially remove these plaques, and in so doing, we'll have cured the condition, Alzheimer's disease. And that makes logical sense, right?
Right.
But the issue is that, drugs have actually succeeded at reducing the plaque in the brain. There are a few reasons why it actually doesn't hold up to biological scrutiny.
Right.
One is that we've engineered drugs that have succeeded at reducing the plaque in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease, and that hasn't actually improved cognition.
Yeah.
So
I've heard you talk about that.
Right. So that's great if we can remove the plaque, I think, but if it's not actually improving the clinical features, the symptomology of the disease, who cares?
Right.
Particularly when those drugs are associated with horrible side effects.
Right.
Right. So if you're not actually improving the cognition of a patient with one of these drugs, right, and you're putting them at risk for brain swelling, brain bleeding, and even possibly accelerated death, accelerated brain atrophy, which actually meta-analyses have shown that a lot of these drugs actually cause.
Wow. Accelerated brain atrophy.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. There was a meta-analysis that found that
which would actually make cognition worse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. You don't want your brain to atrophy. That doesn't sound good. You want it to grow. I mean, exercise causes your brain to grow. Eating DHA fat, from wild salmon causes your brain, is associated with brain growth. So yeah, that's a really bad thing. And then the second feature is that cognitively healthy people do have amyloid in their brains. So it's not, there doesn't seem to be, and there hasn't seemed to be, a very clear correlation between amyloid, this protein, which for decades we've thought to be causal with regards to Alzheimer's disease, and the condition. And that is until a paper was published in 2006 that seemed to renew faith in this so-called amyloid hypothesis, that amyloid, again, is the defining, and causal feature of the disease. What they were able to do is isolate a subtype of amyloid beta, inject it into the body of a cognitively healthy rat. And what they saw was that rat then exhibited profound cognitive dysfunction. So that basically renewed faith down this drug pipeline. because this paper seemed to assert, like, look, this is the missing link. Here's how amyloid directly causes cognitive dysfunction in this amyloid model, right? And that was what was published in Nature, which is like, if you're a scientist and you get to publish in Nature, it's like winning an Academy Award for scientists, right? So it was published. The lead author was this guy, Sylvain Lesny, at University of Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
And that basically, continued to foment this like amyloid hypothesis as the sole guiding, mission for pharmaceutical research for Alzheimer's disease. And subsequently, thousands of papers have referenced this 2006 paper.
Wow.
And what came to light just 2 years ago was that paper was essentially completely fraudulent.
No.
Yeah.
And when you say completely fraudulent, like, it's a pretty big statement. That means it was cognitively designed to mislead. So what portions of it were fraudulent? How do you create a fraudulent study like that for the people listening to the podcast?
Yeah, right. There's like peer review, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like you made it to Nature. I mean, somebody looked at this.
Yeah. Well, so the way that they presented this data was via what's called a Western blot analysis. And without getting into the weeds, essentially it's a way of visually representing the concentration of certain proteins and observable phenomena, not with numbers like on a spreadsheet, but visually.
Right.
And the paper nonetheless was published, but there's a researcher at Vanderbilt University named Matthew Schrag, who's kind of like a sleuth. I mean, he himself is a scientist. But there are all these kind of like niche message boards online of scientists that, perform what's called basically post publication peer review, where they go back into the papers and they crunch the numbers and they find
like a meta-analysis or
mistakes and fraud and things like that. And these are like scientists, so that's what they enjoy doing. Right. I can't relate, but like they're
relate.
Yeah. But there are people that are deep in the trenches and like and for good reason, because there is evidence showing that a lot of our publications are actually fraudulent. Like
no question.
There's a very significant proportion of research that gets published in our most trusted peer-reviewed journals that are fraudulent. And so, and again, continually, I think part of the reason for this paper being flagged specifically, one was that it was very influential, and two, that very recently, certain monoclonal antibody drugs like aducanumab and lecanemab were both given accelerated approval by the FDA, despite experts essentially speaking against this approval for these drugs because they didn't work from a cognitive standpoint. They again were very successful at reducing plaque in the brains of patients, but they coincided with really dramatic and scary side effects. Again, like accelerated brain atrophy and brain bleeds and swelling. And there was actually a panel of 11 experts, including neurologists, who pushed back against the FDA's decision to greenlight this drug, aducanumab, I believe it was specifically. And nonetheless, the FDA greenlit it. It's an incredibly expensive injectable drug that basically turns your brain's immune system, on itself to essentially dissolve and make soluble these proteins so that they can be flushed away. But they didn't actually succeed. They very, very modestly improved cognition in certain patients.
Wow.
But essentially, the benefits weren't worth the risks. This was very clear to see. And so the fact that this all happened within a really short timeline, my speculation is that it tipped this researcher, Matthew Schrag, off to go and investigate this seminal 2006 Nature paper, which he did. And he went in, and as part of the peer review process, they don't look at images like these Western blot images and look for artifacts, to see if they were perhaps Photoshopped. That's not part of the peer review process.
Yeah.
I mean, it might be now, I don't know. But essentially what he found was that it was very clear that these were just cheap cut and paste jobs.
Really?
And that entire paper was basically built on nothing, air.
Wow.
And that was the paper, again, that seemed to connect amyloid with the cognitive dysfunction that we see in patients.
And who was behind the paper? I mean, what's the rationale? Because I think if somebody has a predetermined destination they're trying to get to, there's got to be some benefit for them down the road. Was there a pharmaceutical or a chemical company behind it? Was there
Well, I think it's probably the pressure, from patients and their families, and also these advocacy organizations that continue to foment this funding pipeline and have a lot to gain from a drug getting approved. Like some of these, I'm not even going to name them, but some of the biggest like Alzheimer's organizations, for example.
Wow.
Like their funding pipeline is, all about like we need to find a drug it's basically like a fear-based narrative. Like Alzheimer, there's not much that we can do to prevent or slow the condition. We've got to continue to find, pharmacologic solutions to the condition.
Yep.
The fact that these that drug trials have been such a failure, and I think like it's big money. I mean, aducanumab and lecanemab, despite the fact that they, don't work, and in fact,
despite the fact that they don't work,
they're extremely expensive. And so you can imagine that if you're a desperate patient and you have the means to afford it.
I mean, this is the same thing that's happening with I'm not saying the GLP-1s are as dangerous as something like that, but we have a tendency, I think, we have such a disease-based society. We have an industry that is built upon symptom maintenance and disease management. And, like any other industry, I mean, if you're an airline, you got to fill seats. If you're a hotel, you got to fill rooms. If you're in the chemical, pharmaceutical, the synthetic industry, you have to sell product. And the best way to sell product is, well, number one, don't kill the host, just manage the host's condition. And number two, don't cure the host because they're no longer a client. So, it'd be like if, every car buyer only bought one car in their lifetime, the car dealerships would be out of business. Right. And so I think that, I'm certainly of the mindset that there's not one big, bad, nasty, sinister plan going on at the top to keep us all sick. But what's happened is we just become such an industry of disease, spending $4.5 trillion a year on healthcare, and leading the world in the 6 worst statistics, and including the lowest life expectancy of birth, maternal mortality, infant mortality, type 2 diabetes, morbid obesity, multiple chronic diseases in the same single biome. You would think as medical advancement progressed that disease incidence would be going down, but it's actually not. It's getting worse. Life expectancy is going backwards. And I think the same thing is happening with like these GLPs. It's like, well, everybody's fat. So what do? Give them something to make them skinny. But maybe it was the, toxic soup they've been bathing their cellular biology in for the last 25 years that actually led to this pandemic. And so now taking a step back, now that you have a very good grasp of this industry and some of the malfeasance that went on, you've really sort of championed the narrative surrounding whole food diets, brain healthy foods. I think you partnered with, is it Solus Health?
So yeah,
Solus?
not a partnership.
Okay.
But yeah, that's just an emergent care, like concierge practice that profiled me. Yeah.
Yeah. They profiled you.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you're into the brain boosting foods.
Yeah.
And so talk a little bit about that, because I think when people think of brain boosting things, they go right to neurotropics or, other chemicals and synthetics. Like they would think a brain boosting supplement is Adderall. It's not really a brain booster. It's amphetamine, but so where do you fall in that narrative, and how does that relate back to your mother's condition? I mean, what, after producing this documentary and seeing some of the corruption in our research institutions, what is the next wave? What is the solution?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've definitely, I feel really humbled in the sense that I do feel that I've played a part over the past decade to help usher in the conversation around prevention, which, again, if this is a condition.
You definitely have, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I got started really early. I mean, as soon as my mom started to develop these symptoms and I would start learning, all these things that I've subsequently learned, I felt compelled to share. And I've seen the tide turn in the sense that, back when I started, you couldn't mention Alzheimer's disease or dementia in the same sentence as prevention without being called a charlatan or a quack, And now I feel like it's gained much broader acceptance. We even now have, it seems every 4 years, the Lancet Commission now meeting on dementia prevention and
Dementia prevention. Wow.
Yeah, all the so-called modifiable risk factors, and so
Mhm.
it really is kind of a whole new world, and there's still so many unanswered questions. But as somebody who's long loved nutrition, I definitely take a food forward approach. Although
Mhm.
I'll concede that food is not the only thing that matters. I mean, there are a lot actually, in fact, of so-called modifiable risk factors for these conditions that range from hearing loss to vision loss to air pollution to social isolation.
Social isolation is a big one.
That's a big one. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I love talking about food because we all eat, and there certainly is a ton of corruption, very observable, clearly apparent corruption within, the food industry and the food industry's relationship with,
Yeah. I just did a podcast with Kaylee Means, and he lays it out better than anyone I've ever seen.
Yeah. He's great. I mean, so without stepping on his toes, I mean, everything that he says is dead on.
Mhm.
And this is something that I try in my work to also, do my part to expose as well, because it really is, I mean, in so many ways, a scam. And I feel that, like, my mom in many ways was victimized by a lot of the misinformation that continues to be perpetuated. But certainly, she was of a generation that, didn't really have access to the internet. And she was unique in the sense that, even once the internet came about, she just wasn't on it. And so she was very much in the dark, like so many people today continue to be, about what it actually means to eat healthily. She was fed a narrative about, for example, animal products, animal source foods being really bad for you, being
Right.
bad for the cardiovascular system and all this stuff. And the alternative grain-based products being something that you have to base your diet around. I mean, it literally was
GMO
the base
foods. Yeah.
of the food pyramid.
It still is. I mean, it needs to be flipped on the tip. Yeah.
Yeah. And to be fair, the food pyramid's been retired. We've replaced it with the My Plate, and there's debate whether or not Americans have ever fully followed the dietary guidelines that have been put out. But nonetheless, they're not, they're dietary guidelines, in my view, are an economic instrument to sell commodity food products, subsidized grains and things like that. There's no such thing as an essential grain,
right? Or an essential carbohydrate for that.
As an essential carbohydrate, which is not to say that we shouldn't eat them.
Yeah, no, I agree with you.
But we've just gotten it backwards for so many years about what it looks like to eat a nutrient dense diet.
What's odd is the things that are essential, like essential fatty acids, essential amino acids, those are what get attacked.
Yeah.
Right. Is the proteins and the fats, and those are what are truly essential to life. The minerals, the amino acids, fatty acids. But in any case, getting back to that, there's certainly a narrative that is a big industry narrative that benefits the food industry, the chemical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, which are the most well-funded institutions in the world, and they also have the greatest amount of pressure they can apply to our congressmen and policymakers. They can really shape public policy because they have that much of an influence. And, I often use the term, I believe more in what God gave us than what man makes us. And I say that not as a religious statement, but, I feel like optimal health is found in the world all around us: sunlight, grounding, breath work, exercise, the things that you can't supplement your way out of. Even looking at the Blue Zone research, there wasn't continuity in diets, but there was continuity in a sense of purpose. There was continuity in a sense of community. There was continuity in mobility into later in life, I talk about it all the time. In Sardinia, the life expectancy was directly related to the slope of the hill they walked up and down, right?
Yeah.
And you don't want it to be that simple, but it is that simple. And the further we've gotten away from Mother Nature and the further we've gotten away from the basics, the sicker we become.
Yeah.
And so on your journey, what do you consider a whole food diet, and what are some of the, let's call them brain boosting foods that you're a big advocate of?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important to not major in the minors. And so I've sort of hierarchized. I don't know if that's a word.
I think we'll make it a word. Can we make it a word?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just voted in as a word.
I've created a bit of a food pyramid of my own. And I think the base of that is just prioritize whole foods. We live in a time today. Yeah. Where
I'm so on board with you for that.
Yeah. I mean, that's really it. I mean, anybody who's spent any time on Nutrition X or Instagram can attest to the fact that, well, everything societally has become so polarized, and the diet wars in particular can be particularly egregious in that sense. But you just want to prioritize whole foods. If you do that, I mean, you're way ahead of the game in terms of your average
And
person.
there's a study out there to prove both sides. I mean, I could argue carnivore, keto, paleo, pescatarian, whole food, vegan, vegetarian. I mean, you name it. And I could get dogmatic about it. And I could find my little narrow sliver of research to support it. I could ignore the other research that is out there, and I could put forward that very dogmatic, position.
Yeah. But also that is the commonality among the world's top-lived populations, is that they're eating whole foods. But if you actually get granular, I mean, that's a very low resolution sort of dietary framework, right? But once you start to get granular, you realize that people actually have adopted and can adhere successfully to all different kinds of dietary patterns, some that are more animal-based, some that are more plant-based. But I think, if you're primarily, like, the big rocks are focusing on whole foods, right? Again, 60% of the calories, if not more, today, most people are consuming from packaged, processed vending machine foods, essentially.
Unbelievable.
Food-like products. And so the
more you call food-like products, they're not actually food.
No, they're food-like, right? They provide energy. But you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who's energy deficient today, particularly in the Western world. In fact, globally, we live
overeating issue.
Yeah, this is the first time in human history where we have more overweight people walking the earth than underweight. For the vast majority of our history, it was more underweight. Food scarcity was a real problem, right? You had a greater risk of starving to death than dying from any of one of these 4 or 5 non-communicable conditions that seem to be, outweighing everything else today. But today, actually, obesity is the major
and chronic disease,
And so, moving up my so-called food pyramid, so to speak, I think you really want to prioritize both animal source and plant-based foods. I think it's really important to have both. I butt heads with carnivores. I butt heads with vegans because I think that there's value from both sides of the aisle, so to speak. It's actually like politics these days, right. But
it's sad that you got to be so dogmatic. I've never been dogmatic about a diet, and I'm a human biologist, and I was a mortality researcher for a living, and the truth is, you used the term modifiable risk factors earlier in the podcast. And the truth is, most of the reason why people are not living healthier, happier, longer lives are modifiable risk factors. And one of them is a whole food diet.
Yeah. Most of the conditions that people are suffering from today are the heritability is very low. The heritability for obesity, for cancer, for cardiovascular disease, very low. I mean, it's primarily an epigenetic phenomena. It's an interaction between your genes and your environment. Or your exposome, which is another term that I love. And your exposome, or your environment, encapsulates all of your very many exposures from, what it is that you're eating day in, day out.
I like that one too.
Yeah.
I've learned 2 words today: hierarchalize, which is the jury's still out on that one. Exposome.
No, but exposome's a good one.
Exposome's a great one, dude. I'm going to make sure I weave that in, babe.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's it, in my world, like, I'm, obviously super passionate about helping people prevent conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. Most of the money goes actually into studying the genetics, the heritability of the disease, but they're very seldomly inherited. Parkinson's disease heritability is incredibly low. For Alzheimer's disease, it's somewhat higher, but it's still the vast majority of cases are due to, again,
non-heritable. They don't have the Alzheimer's gene.
Yeah.
And so what is an Alzheimer's preventative diet? What does that look like?
So generally, I like to focus on what I call the genius foods. That's the title of my first book, actually, which is essentially an unofficial owner's manual to the human brain. And these are foods that provide the brain the nutrients that we know help the brain not just survive, but thrive. Nutrients like creatine, carnitine, carnosine, protein. I mean, dietary proteins get broken down into their constituent amino acids, which serve as the backbone precursors to your neurotransmitters, like serotonin, like dopamine.
Yeah, your natural killer cells. I don't think people realize how, they think protein muscle, right? Which is also true. But we don't think protein nervous system, protein, essentially amino acids, protein red blood cells, protein natural killer cells, white blood cells, the immune system, the immune defense, connective tissue, collagen, elastin, fibrin. It's just so critical.
Yeah. And I think protein is really valuable for myriad reasons. I mean, it's important for so many reasons, but I think with regards to the brain, I think it's very important in terms of, I mean, you alluded to this earlier, but in terms of fostering metabolic health, which we're seeing now is intricately related to the health of the brain. In fact, as insulin resistance in the body increases, the brain's ability to generate energy from glucose decreases. So increased insulin resistance in the body, insulin resistance essentially causes your cells to starve because they can't get access to the fuel that they need to generate ATP, which is the energetic currency of cells. And we see that essentially as insulin resistance in the body increases, it also correlates very strongly with a brain that is essentially starving. So you want to make sure that you're as insulin sensitive as possible. And there's a bounty of evidence showing us that higher protein diets seems to relate to increased to better metabolic health because it's the most satiating macronutrient. So when you prioritize protein in your diet, you tend to consume less energy from carbohydrates and fat. So I think it's really important from that standpoint. And it's also the macronutrient that is most supportive of your musculature, of your skeletal muscle, which is really important from a metabolic health standpoint.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important from a brain health perspective, is making sure that you're in the best metabolic health possible.
And what do you prefer as protein sources? I mean, obvious sources: grass-fed meats, pasture-raised eggs, free-range chicken.
Yeah. So the evidence, obviously wild fatty fish, oily fish, that's the least controversial protein from a brain health standpoint, like wild salmon, sardines, herring, mackerel, anchovies. Those are all great, but I've certainly planted a flag because I believe that red meat is a very helpful food from the standpoint of the brain as well.
So do I.
And it doesn't need, I think there's this, with the rise and the proliferation and popularity of keto diets, a lot of people, will take that will take that to represent fatty meat. I actually think there's an argument to be made for opting for leaner meat. First of all, to me, it's very obvious when you feed a cow its biologically appropriate diet, it's a leaner animal. So to me, these ultra fattened products of the factory farm system, a modern cow, to me, that's they're fed biologically aberrant diets, which give them a biologically aberrant fatty acid profile. They're fattier, their fat isn't as healthy. And so for me,
higher omega-6 to omega-3, you mean those ratios?
Yeah, a grass-fed, grass-finished cut of red meat has higher levels of omega-3s, higher levels of certain tocopherols, which is a form of vitamin E. There's actually a much higher level of antioxidant phytochemicals in grass-fed, grass-finished beef.
Wow.
Which is super interesting.
We don't think about phytochemicals in meats. I think mainly we think about phytonutrients being
from
plant-based. Yeah.
But cows that are fattened up on grass, they accumulate and store more of these antioxidant phytochemicals.
Wow.
And as well as carotenoids, which are really beneficial to eye health and brain health, like lutein and zeaxanthin and beta carotene. And there are all these other nutrients like iron that are in their most bioavailable form in red meat. So I see no argument, no scientifically valid argument to avoid lean red meat. I think certain people with certain genetic backgrounds might see an exaggerated response to certain saturated fatty acids. And so I think the safest recommendation to make is for lean meat. And I think from that standpoint, it's a total health food. And there was a study that was recently published that found that, just sort of putting a bow on the value of animal protein, that found that animal protein compared to plant protein actually led to a slower rate of hippocampal atrophy. So shrinkage of the brain's memory center.
Okay.
And the effect was particularly strong for seafood. But I think that there
Meaning
could be
in
some
favor of seafood.
in favor of seafood.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but I think there could be some healthy user bias there because fish eaters tend to be more health conscious. Like pescatarians are very health conscious,
Right.
typically, so they do other things. It's called healthy user bias.
Mhm.
But it did find, a reduced rate of shrinkage of the memory center for all animal proteins.
Wow.
Yeah. Beef, poultry.
We got to dig that up and throw that study on that.
Yeah, it was a great study.
I'll figure out what it is after the podcast and I'll throw it into the show notes.
Yeah, so I'm a big advocate of grass-fed, grass-finished beef, fish, poultry. I think is great, free range, ideally. Eggs. An egg is a cognitive multivitamin.
Oh my gosh, I know, man. I say this all the time. I'm so happy you're here because we're so on the same page with that. I mean, I think because it has a little bit of cholesterol in it, of which only 15% of your blood cholesterol even comes from your diet.
Yeah,
the majority of it's
minimally
manufactured by the liver. I think that, and I think that a lot of people don't realize that the influence on the liver's production of cholesterol is way more important than the dietary cholesterol that you eat. They think, well, I'll just get my dietary cholesterol to zero because I know that cholesterol is bad. And if my cholesterol is high, I have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, which I would also argue is not necessarily the case. And so there's a war on cholesterol too, that's still, I think, sticking around from even the 90s. My parents are that way. Still to this day, that the cholesterol, is to be avoided at all costs.
Yeah.
But I think I totally agree with you. I think eggs are nature's multivitamin. They have perfect protein.
Want direct access to me so I can personally answer your most pressing health questions? Then I'm excited to offer you free access to my premium membership, the Rule Breckas. As a Rule Brecka, you'll be able to join me for monthly Q&A sessions, VIP access to all the challenges I host, and advanced access to my most exclusive content. To get your free 30-day trial of Rule Breckas, head over to joinrulebreckas.com. That's joinrulebreckas.com right now. Now let's get back to the Ultimate Human podcast.
Yeah, you absorb minimal. I mean, dietary cholesterol is actually not all that bioavailable. And as you mentioned, yeah, most of the cholesterol in your body is produced by the liver, but every cell produces cholesterol. It's a vitally important nutrient.
Mhm.
And from a blood lipid standpoint, for most people, it's of minimal concern. And you can actually, there are tests that you can do because phytosterols and cholesterol compete for the same absorption in the gut. And so you can actually, there's certain tests that you can do that can look at the presence of certain phytosterols in your blood, which are xenobiotic for us humans.
Mhm.
Like, we don't produce them; we only get them from our diet, and so that can be used as an indicator of cholesterol absorption.
Mm-hmm.
So some people are hyperabsorbers, but it's a minority of
Right.
people. Certain dietary saturated fatty acids do raise cholesterol. The degree to which they do, it's genetically mediated, and I think this whole idea of demonizing nutrients in isolation is nonsensical.
I do too.
Yeah, I think if when we're talking about whole foods, and particularly foods that are properly grown or raised,
Mm-hmm.
I think that there shouldn't be a concern.
Yeah, I agree with you. And remember too that cholesterol, which is not a fuel source, it's more of a construction material, fuel, like building cell walls and cell membranes and hormones and vitamin D3, cholesterol. But it doesn't show up to cause the damage. It shows up because of the damage, right? I mean, it's called to the site, right, of damage. And I think just much like the Alzheimer's analogy, these amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles are the byproducts of the process, not the cause of the process. And I think, cholesterol is very often at the scene of the crime, but it's not who pulled the trigger, right? I mean, it's like if this house caught on fire, the firemen would show up. But they were called to this location to put the fire out.
Yeah.
I sort of look at cholesterol in the same light. It gets called to a lot of locations in the body to help heal and repair, actually, damage. And then we blame it for the atherosclerotic conditions that a lot of, the narrowing of the arteries.
Yeah, there's debate, as I think there should be. Like, does cholesterol accumulate and form these fatty streaks as a result purely of just the concentration of cholesterol in the blood, or is it a result of oxidation, the oxidation of these lipoproteins, or inflammation, or heightened blood sugar, metabolic distress, endothelial injury? I think these are all this is an important conversation to have. And, all I know is, if you take a food focused approach and you avoid, ultra processed foods, this idea that lipoproteins are inherently atherogenic to me, doesn't really stand to reason in the sense that our bodies produce it, similar to like blood glucose. Like we do need a certain amount of sugar in our bloods.
And it's okay for your sugar to rise and fall, for sure.
Yeah. At what point does that become pathologic? It's like our brains produce amyloid beta. What's the reason for it? Well, it turns out if you have a certain viruses in your brain, we can actually see amyloid beta accumulate around these viruses, which, are doing so to perform a protective response. So everything in the body, I think, has probably, passed millennia of natural selection for a reason. I don't think our livers are necessarily trying to kill us.
Right.
And, that would be weird, wouldn't it?
Right. Yeah, that would be a bad design by our creator.
Yeah. So I don't know. But on the other hand, you do get, to be fair, you do get people in the carnivore community that are walking around with extremely high levels of total cholesterol, ApoB, LDL, and we don't have the data to say that that's safe. I know that there are certain people in that community who are also scientists who are looking to confirm, this notion of the lean mass hyperresponder and all that stuff. And I think that's all really important research, and I'm happy to see it, But everybody today on social media is very polarized. It's like either our cholesterol needs to be like, it's something that we shouldn't think about at all, and it's fine if it's like up in the 500s, or that we should be like vegans, and aspire to have the total cholesterol of a newborn, which I think is BS as well.
Right.
So the truth is obviously, as it usually is, somewhere in the middle, I'm sure. And I hope that that within my lifetime we could
finally settle the score.
Yeah.
Where do you fall on things like fasting for brain health?
I think there was a lot of excitement about that, 10, 15 years ago. And I think that a lot of that interest was spurred by Mark Mattson at the NIH, he's at the NIH, who did a lot of these early basic science studies with mice. And he found that fasting led to increased neurogenesis and BDNF expression. But I think newer studies in humans have kind of shown that, well, there are no really long-term studies. So it's a lot of it's like mechanistic speculation. So I don't think that, if you enjoy fasting, I think there are certain benefits to it. I think there are definitely benefits to heeding our own natural circadian rhythms with regards to food, meal timing and the like. So I think there's certainly value there. But I don't necessarily think it's like the silver bullet against brain aging that a lot of people make it out to be, Yeah, there was a study that actually, I don't know. I don't remember the details of the study, but, I don't think that it found as strong of an upregulation of BDNF as a response to fasting in humans that most would have expected based on the kind of pop, in
intermittent fasting and fasting in general.
Yeah, I think fasting is good in the sense that when you're fasting, you're not eating, and so many of us today struggle with weight. I think eating earlier meals, time restricted eating, I think makes sense from a circadian standpoint.
I agree with that.
There's cardiometabolic benefits to that. Lower blood, better blood pressure management, blood sugar management, all that stuff. But if you don't enjoy it, if it's not feasible to your lifestyle, I don't think it's something that you have to feel like you're missing out on.
So whole foods diet, which I wholly agree with you, not particularly avoiding, grass-fed, grass-finished meats and pasture-raised eggs, fatty fish, free-range chicken. I often say it's not the food, it's the distance from the food to the table. So I'm curious where you fall on the seed oil debate. And then I want to get into some supplementation with you as well.
Yeah. Oh man, you really want to go there?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. So I don't bring them into my house. I think that there is a reasonable cause for concern around their consumption. Much of the conversation seems to focus on, these proximal biomarkers that are related to chronic disease, but the evidence is kind of all over the place.
You mean pro-inflammatory markers, like?
Yeah, like how they affect blood lipids, for example, like LDL cholesterol. You know, they're sort of given this universal green light because relative to saturated fats, seed oils tend to lower LDL cholesterol. So the medical and nutritional orthodoxy basically gives them a green light for that reason. They seem to be perfectly healthy because they lower LDL. But I think questions still remain about what do they do to the quality of the LDL? You know, an LDL particle isn't an LDL particle. I mean, you have small dents, you have big and fluffy, you've got, you know, LDL particles that are tugging around these, you know, oxidized fatty acids. Does that make them more atherogenic? I mean, there's some evidence that suggests that they might be. The observational data on seed oils is confounded, I think.
I agree.
You know,
but I think a lot of that is biased too. I mean, probably very much like these Alzheimer's, you know,
yeah, like funded by the industry. Yeah. Well, you know, and I think a lot of influencers and whatever on social media today will make them out to be the sole smoking gun and do everything from, like, you know, I don't think that they drive obesity independent of the calories that they offer. For example, but I do think there's still some concern about, you know, their vulnerability to oxidation and the generation of these byproducts of oxidation, like certain aldehydes and things like that, when they're heated and reheated. And I also think from a long-term, like, brain health standpoint, from tissues and organs outside of the field of lipidology, like from a brain health standpoint,
right,
there's still lots of questions about how the overconsumption of these oils over a lifetime, what those you know, those oils are doing to our brain health. And there was a paper published by Taha. He's a UC Davis researcher, single author paper, but it presented some, the title of the paper is Linoleic Acid, Good or Bad for the Brain. And it presents, I think, some really important questions about what the chronic overconsumption of these fats is doing from a brain health standpoint. There was one randomized control trial that found that when people reduced their consumption of these oils, they saw reduced migraine frequency, which is a neurovascular neuroinflammatory event. And you know, so like, do I freak out when I consume them when I'm eating out at restaurants?
Yeah, because they are everywhere.
They are everywhere. Yeah. But I make an effort not to bring them into my house.
Yeah.
And
I do the same.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I do think that it's reasonable to be skeptical about them. They're highly marketed. They have only been, you know, in the human food supply for the past 50 or so years. They've been heavily marketed as healthy. So there's healthy user bias. Like, the observational research tends to show that people who consume them have better health, counterintuitively, right? But polyunsaturated fats and even linoleic acid are present in some of the healthiest foods that we have access to, nuts and seeds and things like that.
Right.
Fish. I don't think polyunsaturated fats are bad. I think they're great. It's when extracted from the food matrix that normally protects those fats, those vulnerable fatty acids from oxidation and damage, that then those oils, I think, those fats become a concern.
Yeah.
But observational research, I mean, you know, even grain and seed oils, they're marketed as healthy. You go to the supermarket, they have the
They're
Red Heart
baby
Healthy
formulas. I think it's actually a requirement, if I'm not mistaken, in the United States to actually have seed oils in baby formula.
Right. So people who use them and who avoid meat, they might be more likely to take a multivitamin. They might be eating fish and nuts and seeds more regularly. So I think the observational data is confounded. I think the randomized control trials are typically too short term, and they're a little all over the place. I mean, there's debate about, you know, for example, the Minnesota Coronary Survey, and
that's the big one. Yeah.
That's the big one. People will say that, well, they were consuming seed oils and they had a higher incidence of mortality, but back then the seed oils, you know, they would use they had trans fats in the mix as well, and we know that those are now poisonous.
Yeah.
But I just think from a precautionary standpoint principle, you're better off reducing your consumption. And there's way more evidence anyway for extra virgin olive oil.
Yeah.
Like the Mediterranean dietary pattern, it's extra virgin olive oil. It's a primary fat. The Mind diet only makes a recommendation for extra virgin olive oil. And so this idea that seed oils are beneficial, I just think it doesn't make any sense. Now, there's like certain seed oils I think are healthy, like sesame seed oil, which are basically the result of pressed sesame seeds, right? They don't go through the refining, the bleaching, the deodorization, all of these steps.
Hexane, the sodium hydroxide.
Yeah.
all of those steps. And what about, where do you fall on the supplementation bandwagon? Is there any, in your opinion, must-haves? I mean, what do you supplement with, if anything? I believe that people should supplement for deficiency, not just sort of the sake of supplementing, throwing in, a lot of great named things.
Yeah.
But I've become a believer in NMN and resveratrol and other supplements over the years, because in our clinic system, we've been able to see the impact that those have had directly on certain markers in the blood. And for me, even though that is a large data set, some could argue it's anecdotal. We've still seen enough of it that, I'm a fan of certain supplementation, but I'm curious where you fall on the supplementation bandwagon, if there's any like must-haves for the brain.
For sure. I mean, I supplement regularly with protein powder. I love creatine. I think, there's a lot of evidence now, creatine from both a physical performance standpoint, metabolic health standpoint, cognitive health. It's very much worth your while, I think, generally, to supplement with creatine. I mean, if you have a medical condition, check with your doctor, but it's very safe.
And inexpensive. I mean, it's not like one of those things that's going to break your budget.
I'm a huge fan of astaxanthin, which is a marine carotenoid, which is actually one of the few compounds that showed efficacy in the National Institutes of Health's interventions testing program. So it actually led to an increase in lifespan for mice, but it's a mammalian aging model in a very heterogeneous group of mice by about 10%. Really great for brain health, cardiovascular health, joint health. So I'm a huge fan of astaxanthin. I've been taking that for the past 15 years. Magnesium, I think, is great.
Most of us fan of that too.
Yeah.
Magnesium deficient. Yeah. It's like D3 deficiency. You want to talk about a pandemic. I mean, those are two that we are pandemically low in.
Yeah. Exactly. I'm trying to think. I don't like over supplement, but those are kind of like the basics. Fish oil. I'm a big believer in fish oil. Yeah. Not taking too high a dose, but taking, I take about 1 gram to 1.5 grams a day.
Good EPA, DHA fish oil. I'm a huge fan of that too. I mean, again, if you get back to the essential amino acids, essential fatty acids, there are certain ones, if you don't get, you would die. The problem is most of us are not getting enough of the right ones, and we're getting them out of ratio. And I completely agree with you that nature has a way of presenting foods in the community in which they should exist. Like fructose gets a really, really bad rap, and people are like, well, there's fructose in blueberries, you shouldn't eat blueberries. But there's fructose, there's glucose, but there seems to be some evidence that when they're consumed together, they have a different impact on the insulinogenic response than just if you were to take fructose, or high fructose corn syrup, which is a non-naturally highly concentrated product. And we know what happens when you have high amounts of high fructose corn syrup. Yeah. So I'm in full agreement with you on that diet. And what is a day in the life of you look like a diet, exercise? Do you use any modalities? Would you consider yourself a biohacker? Are you using any red lights or?
I mean, I guess kind of, but maybe a more low-tech biohacker. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. I'm a bit lower.
Mini biohacker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll tell you,
I've actually become a lot more low-tech as time's gone on. It's funny you say that. Just like when I say low-tech, sunlight, grounding, breath work, we don't have a cold plunge here. I jumped in the pool out there.
I'll give you my top 3 biohacking tools that I have in my house.
Here we go. Here they come, guys. Top 3 biohackers.
Yeah. So number 1 is a mattress cooling pad. That actually has dramatically improved my sleep. I'm a huge fan of having a mattress cooling pad.
8 Sleep. I use an 8 Sleep.
That's what I have.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm a huge fan of that too.
I wake up sweaty without one typically. And it's just great.
I find that both my deep and REM is elongated. Like the amount of time that I spend in bed, and I post my sleep scores all the time, and just wanted to park on that subject for a second. Because there's so many sleep hacks, right? That one has seemed to really work for me.
Yeah.
Too.
It also reduces your air conditioning costs, I think.
So there's an ancillary benefit. Yeah. Mine are bigger in Miami than yours are in LA. So I have a little less sympathy for you.
The second would be that I got recently an under desk treadmill. So like an under desk, like a standing desk treadmill.
Really?
Yeah.
That's a Ben Greenfield move right there.
$300 on Amazon. That thing will get you shredded. I mean, because, walking on a treadmill, first of all, walking is the ultimate fat burning exercise. It doesn't increase hunger, very low impact, torches calories, and easy to walk while doing other things.
Right.
Unlike other cardio.
I think it's the most underrated exercise in the world. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, it's incredible. But like walking on a treadmill at the gym or even walking around like outside, first of all, in LA, it's kind of hard to do, but it can be boring. But when I'm working at my standing desk or even, watching a podcast or what have you, I can pass 30 minutes easy on it with the under desk treadmill. It's such a small monetary investment for what I think is a really big win. I've like been shocked to look down at my walking treadmill and see that 45 minutes has passed, because 45 minutes in the gym environment, which is prior to owning.
You feel like, every minute of it.
You feel every minute of it.
Yeah. You feel
exactly.
every minute.
When is this going to be over? You know? So I think that's great. And then my third top biohacking tool, and this is really low tech, is a digital kitchen food scale. I think that is, everybody should have a digital kitchen food scale.
Really?
Yeah. It's the best way to audit like portion sizes, both in terms of like making sure that you're getting the amount of protein, you're hitting your protein target every day. I think it's incredible.
So you throw a little cellophane on it, pop your meats, whatever on there.
Yeah. Or anything, just making sure it's a way of, establishing portion control where that might otherwise be difficult. It just provides a little bit of a mental barrier. For example, I'll give you like a perfect like real world practical application. I went to Costco the other day and I bought one of my favorite indulgences, a huge bag, because at Costco everything's like massive, oversized, right? Huge bag of dried mango.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, after my wife's heart, she loves those.
I could eat that entire bag. I could in one sitting eat 5,000 calories of dried mango if I pulled out all the stops and just let myself go. But they're not portioned out, right? So for me, and it's shocking actually when you realize, when you do an audit, and you can only do this with a digital food scale. It's way more accurate than measuring portions by volume. A 40-gram serving of dried mango is 140 calories. I can eat a 40-gram serving of dried mango in one mouthful.
Right.
So it kind of opens your eyes to the fact that how rapidly and how calorie dense certain foods can be. And it's just a little bit more friction sometimes to going back for that second portion, so I'll portion it out, 40 grams of dried mango. That's what
that actually seems pretty, it's low tech, but I mean, it's pretty quick too, right? Yeah. This isn't like super advanced meal prep and planning. This is like, hey, I'm, as I pull it out of the fridge, it can tap the scale and I get an idea of my portion size. I kind of like that guardrail.
Yeah. If you want to indulge in the occasional ice cream here and there, you want to measure it by it's the most accurate way of measuring your portion size. But I'll even do it with protein powder. If I know that if I buy protein powder in bulk, which I do to economize, and I want to ingest 25 grams of protein. Well, 25 grams of protein is 30 grams of this protein powder. So it's great to be able to have a way to just measure that out. And, I would have scoffed prior to actually owning one.
Right.
It's such a simple, stupid little tool, it's $10 on Amazon, but it's actually, I use it multiple times a day, every single day.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, I have some really low tech devices that I use for sleep that I can't live without now, just a soft sleep mask. And I don't know if it's that sort of cocoon feeling that I have, but blocking the light out, and my sleep scores are demonstratively better when I block all the light, because sometimes we're at Airbnb and the curtains don't close all the way, in a hotel, and the light comes in, and how photosensitive we are to light, in the mornings when it hits your lids, it's starting to wake you up. I find that I sleep a lot better with some of these.
Those are great. Sleep masks.
Low tech devices. I even when I remember we'll do mouth tape, I notice my HRV does improve when I do mouth tape, but I also don't have any breathing issues. If you got nasal issues, it can be the worst thing. But if you have clear nasal passages, I do notice a little uptick in above my baseline. My HRV does improve when I mouth tape. So I'm with you on a lot of these lower tech devices. I also have like the big fancy red light beds and everything. And I sort of sabotaged myself the other day because we have a little spot out in Colorado, very, very humble bedroom log cabin, and it's completely off the grid, like solar fed electricity, glacier fed spring water. And when I go out there, I go for these ruck walks in the morning, and I get back, and every single time I get back to the house, it strikes me how amazing I feel. I'm like, I feel like I took a limitless pill, or like I just won the lottery. And so I'm like, I like this more than any of the fancy stuff I have in Miami. I just sort of blew up my line of business. But I feel better doing that than I do the daily red light beds and even the cold plunging and all of that, which I'm a huge fan of. Just like a ruck walk in the woods.
Oh yeah.
At 10,000 feet on a cool day. And I'm a little uncomfortable on the walk. And I'm a little bit cold and I'm winded because I'm at 10,500 feet, but I get back and I'm like, I feel amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, I really identify with your message, because a lot of it is getting us back to the basics, and not chasing the so exotic things. And were there any takeaways for you from the documentary that you did on the journey with your mom that we didn't cover? Like, what were some of the big takeaways for you besides corruption in our food supply and our, and our research?
For one thing that really shocked me was the risk that excessive surgeries actually can have on brain health. My co-director in the project, Chris Newhard, who was the editor of the film, his mother-in-law was cognitively normal and went into a surgery to fix something with her hip, I think, and came out essentially with dementia, requiring around-the-clock care.
Wow.
So you just want to be careful with
unnecessary surgeries.
Yeah.
Wow.
And anything that really...
And you think that's anesthesia related?
I think possibly. Yeah. I'm not 100% sure. It's also interesting, and this is another thing that is surprising, is that there's still a lot of aspects of modern life that threaten the brain that have not yet been acknowledged.
EMFs.
Yeah, possibly. I don't know, but I know that, for example, the latest Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention identified 14 modifiable risk factors, right? And that's up from 12 in 2020. And so, you just have to think about the fact that 4 years from now, we might have 16. 8 years from now, we might have 20, so there's still, and just because something has been identified as a modifiable risk factor today doesn't mean that it wasn't putting your brain at risk yesterday.
Right.
So that's why I think it's always smart to practice the precautionary principle, which they've adopted in Europe. They'll put a product on the market and consider it essentially guilty, or they'll consider a new chemical or a newfangled product guilty until proven innocent. It's got to go through way more hoops than it does here in this country. That's why you actually see, a lot of products that are approved here in the United States, or have ingredients here in the United States, where you'll find the exact same product over in Europe that has seemingly a much cleaner ingredients list. Yeah. Because they practice what's called the precautionary principle. Yeah. Their regulatory bodies don't seem to be as in bed as ours do with the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry. And so I think it's always smart to, we have to get back to trusting our instincts. Yeah. And practicing this precautionary principle and using common sense, because science doesn't have all the answers. Yeah. It's really important to just, I think, be mindful of that. Yeah. Like there's a huge category of drugs called anticholinergics, which we know increase risk for dementia. Like a lot of these antihistamine drugs, over the counter.
Well, they speed cognitive decline.
They speed. Yes.
Yeah. And how oxymoronic is it that Alzheimer's patients on anticholinergic drugs are having accelerated cognitive decline? That seems like the most oxymoronic outcome of a drug choice. It's like, the SSRIs link to increased suicidal ideation. Ideation. Yeah. You made up 2 words during the podcast, so I deserve one. Yeah. But
I'll give you a license.
But a lot of very heinous crimes, even violent crimes, are done, by people who are on SSRIs, because it sort of takes away their ability to feel empathy and even this recent school shooting in Atlanta, they said this kid, 14-year-old kid, was, a pump full of SSRIs. But here we are with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors to try to manage a depressive state, and you get an outcome of, a side effect of crushing depression and increased suicidal ideation. I mean, that it seems of all of the drugs to have that side effect, it would be a different drug with that side effect, but not the drug that's actually targeting depression.
Mm-hmm.
It's like obesity being caused by Ozempic, it's kind of so oxymoronic.
Obesity being caused by a Ozempic deficiency.
Yeah, Ozempic deficiency.
Yeah.
That's one that I use a lot. I'm like, listen, if you have ADHD, you're not deficient in Adderall. If you're obese, you weren't deficient in.
No, I think it's a very fair way of looking about these kinds of conditions. I mean, I'm not anti-drugs. Like I think, I have a family member who takes Ozempic because his,
we use it in our clinical practice. We have had thousands of patients successfully on it.
I'm not anti, but they should always be a last line of defense.
Right.
Like I'm very drug conservative when it comes to drugs, but like I have like low back issues, and I'll occasionally take I'm grateful that I have a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory as a get out of jail free card when I need it. Like the turmeric and curcumin can only take me so far sometimes, but they should be a last line of defense.
I agree with you. Well, Max, this has been amazing. I'm definitely going to continue to follow your journey. I would encourage everybody to check out your documentary. For my audience that wants to know more about you or get a hold of your book, I mean, how do they find you? Your podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. So I host a podcast called The Genius Life,
which I've been on.
Yeah, great episode. We put up episodes twice a week. And I've written 3 books. Genius Foods is my first one. It's really like a care manual for the human brain. So if you want to do a deep dive into any of these topics, grab that. And then Little Empty Boxes at littleemptyboxes.com. It's my why. So anybody who's ever had a loved one with dementia will find, I think, incredible solace in the film. Well, they'll find some answers. Mm-hmm. They'll feel less alone. And we've gotten incredible reviews for it. I'm very grateful. And it's a very personal film. So
amazing.
Make sure you have your tissue box close by.
I end every podcast by asking all my guests the same question. There's no right or wrong answer to this question. And that is, what does it mean to you to be an ultimate human?
Well, I like that.
Yeah.
It's similar on my podcast. I ask, what does living a genius life mean to you?
I remember when you asked me that, and I was like, damn it, why didn't I actually prepare for this? So you didn't prepare either. So here we go.
No. What is being an ultimate human? I think it's somebody who lives with integrity, an open mind, curiosity, who does the best they can to use their tools, their skills, their gifts, because everybody has gifts. Everybody was given, was given a handful of gifts to reduce suffering in the world. I think that's important. I think life is suffering in many ways. Nobody escapes it. And I think doing your part to, that doesn't mean that you're not going to piss some people off along the way, because sometimes you have to make difficult decisions, but to do your best to reduce suffering in the world.
Do your best to reduce suffering in the world. That's amazing. Max, we're definitely going to have you back. Thank you for coming on The Ultimate Human today.
Gary. You're the man.
Appreciate you so much.
Same.
And as always, guys, that's just science.